Beautiful little introduction, and thank you everybody for paying attention to what we're about to do here, and thank you to PsyTech Global for having us. My name is Todd Shapiro. I'm the CEO of Red Light Holland. I've been asked to moderate a really great panel that I'm very excited to be a part of, and really very grateful to be here. And I look forward to introducing you to our panelists, and let's bring them on right now with this educational, candid, and well, hopefully a fun chat. We have Rob Barrow, we have Ronan Levy, and we got Lars Wilde. And I think instead of me giving you their introductions about what they do and the companies that they work with and for and everything that they're about to be doing in the psychedelic sector, I would rather have a personal touch on the intros. And why don't we start with Rob?
Yeah, thanks so much, Todd. So Rob Barrow, I'm the CEO of MindMed. I've been previously the Chief Development Officer. And before this, I've been working with a number of companies in the psychedelic space. My background is in pharmacology. I'm a drug developer by trade, worked in a number of different programs, a number of different organizations over the years, and seeing a tremendous opportunity with the psychedelic drug class, and excited to be working with Ronan and Lars and our collective ecosystem of psychedelic organizations to bring these through to approvals.
Thank you very much, Rob. Why don't we go on to Ronan?
Thanks, Todd. Good to see you. My name is Ronan Levy. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive chairman of Field Trip Health. At Field Trip, we are building what is the largest vertically integrated psychedelics company. And what that means is that we're working with drug development through our Field Trip Discovery division, advancing work on FT104, which is our first molecule in development, which we're incredibly excited about. But because with psychedelics, what we're talking about is contextual medicine, it's experiential medicine, where the setting and the therapy that surrounds the actual drug experience has a significant impact on the therapeutic outcomes, at least based on the evidence to date. We felt it was essential to be working with both aspects of a psychedelic medicine experience, the drug as well as the experience. And through our Field Trip Health division, we're building out the clinical infrastructure to deliver psychedelic therapies at scale across North America primarily, but ultimately with a view to expanding around the world, hopefully at some point.
Thank you, Ronan. And Lars.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Great to be on a panel with you. My background is in healthcare investing and in tech. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I have started Compass Pathways together with my co-founders, 𝗙cie and George, after treating my own treatment-resistant depression and generalized anxiety disorder with 𝗙𝗪𝗏 after psychiatry had failed me. So I'm very passionate about bringing these medicines to the world as quickly as possible. We're doing so at the moment. We've just completed our phase 2B recruiting into the study with over 216 patients. So we should have results before the end of the year, and the goal is to hopefully, with positive results, embark on the phase 3 program early next year, and then drive the psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression to approval 24, 25, hopefully with all the caveats of running large-scale clinical trials.
Thank you, Lars. And of course, this session is titled The Geo Opportunities and the Challenges in Building a Psychedelic Company, as we're setting up shop here, and we all four have that in common. I want to start off with the fun stuff, though, just to get a little personal touch again with all of you. Who here has used psychedelics and maybe used some of the psychedelics that you have, your companies are behind in supporting?
Starting with a loaded question, Todd?
I just think it's, I think it's important if we're here talking about psychedelics, what's the know-how, what's the experiences personally with them?
I'm happy to jump in, which is like I have some experience with psychedelics. Certainly, I speak pretty openly about it on our podcast. I'm definitely not the most experienced psychedelic warrior out there, but certainly do have firsthand experiences, and they have been transformative. Maybe not quite as elegant as Lars's experience, but they've definitely been very meaningful to me.
Lars?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in my introduction, I found my way to psychedelics through my own bout of mental health problems, and never did any drugs before other than alcohol and caffeine, and so I was very careful looking into what I got myself into, and yeah, psilocybin therapy or psilocybin helped me tremendously. The important disclaimer, no one should feel they should run out there and try to treat themselves. I think there's a strong argument for therapeutic container, making sure patients access this treatment safely. I think that's why we're all doing our work here. But obviously that led to my very strong conviction that we have something very meaningful for patients here, at least for some of the patients that share characteristics that I had. And as Ronan said, has been a very they have been very meaningful experiences for me.
Great to hear. And Rob?
Yeah, it's not something that we organizationally talk about much at all, or individually. Our personal backgrounds, I think the important part from our angle is that we are drug developers. We're trying to take new therapies to market, and we follow the science. So, with all drugs, historically, if you go back a long ways, physicians, there was this perceived responsibility for physicians to be taking the drugs that they were administering. And I think that the world's really certainly moved far beyond that, which is not to discount the conviction that folks get, and nothing negative about Lars or Ronan or anyone else's experiences, but it's just not an area that we really talk about or dig into. I think we see a tremendous opportunity. We've heard a lot of stories, seen a lot of patients that have benefited, and that's really what gives us our conviction and keeps us going.
And to that, Rob, have you seen people benefit, like a Lars, say, for example, or others who have publicly talked about this stuff in terms of using recreational product or a product that they may have got, in areas where they're allowed to get, or even where they weren't allowed to get?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, recreational, I think, is a word that is not particularly descriptive enough, I think, for what we're talking about. I think there's a number of underground therapists around the world who have publicly talked about working with psychedelics. It's not something that we are in a position to condone or really say much about, but we certainly have colleagues and friends in psychiatry and the broader world who are excited about the potential here, and their excitement is born out of that history and seeing this out in the real world being used. So to the extent that any drugs that are available, not through clinical research studies of psychedelics right now, those are all recreational or illicit products at the moment. So to some extent, yes, but again, I wouldn't say that I would put a huge asterisk by that and say it's not recreational use that we've seen translate into clinical benefit, rather coming by compounds that are recreationally available and then trying to use them in a therapeutic setting.
Yeah, and Ronan, sorry, I didn't mean to be loaded. Honestly, I thought that some had disclosed this, obviously, and it does lead to where I'm getting at, though, which is the geo opportunities and the hurdles in terms of our industries. But a lot of it really was from the point where a lot of people had these transformational experiences, wanted to make the most of these situations, wanted to give back for the potential of mental health purposes, and helping, obviously, with this massive ailment going on in the world, not only always, but way more currently based on COVID. And I wanted to know, I guess, with Lars then, what have you seen in terms of your research and worldly opportunities in terms of people being more, I guess, governments or regulatory bodies being, more forgiving or more allowing to you to go and research these types of substances?
Yeah, that is a great question, Todd. Because when I came into this field, I thought this might be an insurmountable obstacle in some jurisdictions to actually run at least regulatory relevant studies. Obviously, there had been a lot of academic work, and that paved the way. And I think there's a general misunderstanding when we talk about psychedelic research, because there's now the storyline out there that kind of psychedelic research stopped in 1970, 71, and that's not true. So actually research outside of the United States continued, especially in continental Europe. Switzerland, the University of Zurich under Franz Wallenweider was still driving this, and he was responsible for hundreds and hundreds of sessions with psychedelics with his team that showed how these substances can be administered safely, also under kind of modern conditions of running trials. And then when eventually the field was restarted with Rick Strassman and then the other universities in the United States and UK following along, that generated the evidence required to engage in the dialogue again with the FDA, the Canadian regulator, UK regulator, and the European Medicines Agency. And I think, you know, if my co-founder George was here, he would say, look, we ran into open doors. So people are really waiting for something new. And there are a couple of, you know, there's this VC question that probably all of us on this call have been asked: why now? You know, why not 10 years ago? Why not in 10 years? Why is now the right moment? And I think it was a confluence of factors. I think we were suffering from a global mental health pandemic, and the regulators do not have anything to offer, nor does the psychiatric establishment for the people that finally enter the refractory part of the patient population. Then we had the amazing research coming out of Yale with ketamine that led to first the revolution with racemic ketamine, then the follow-on with J&J, the pharma arm of the Janssen, the pharma arm of Johnson & Johnson, getting into the game, getting Spravato approved for TRD, for suicidal ideation. Then Michael Pollan's amazing book coming out, and everyone in the investor community seems to have read How to Change Your Mind. And so suddenly you also had the capital available, the regulatory environment was there, the universities were looking to start psychedelic research. And so it was the perfect storm to really, you know, take this opportunity and drive it forward. It's a lot of work. Obviously, it comes with a lot of logistics. It's not helpful that psilocybin is a Schedule 1 substance. Everybody needs to be licensed. Everybody needs to be trained. But it's, you know, you just got to diligently work through the system, and you can run the trials, and you eventually, with the right evidence of safety and efficacy, get these treatments approved.
That might, you know, I think set up a great opportunity to lead me back to Rob, because you used to work for a non-for-profit for 𝗎𝘀𝗧, and now you're obviously on the commercial capital market side with MindMed. And have you seen a difference with that investment back into capital? Is that part of the reason why maybe there was a pivot for you, because there was more of an opportunity to actually get these studies done, to actually try to make a difference? Was it more difficult in the non-for-profit sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think just generically, certainly it's easier to come by capital with for-profit businesses than it is for not-for-profits. Asking people to part with their money on a promise that you're going to deliver something is a little different than having an economic incentive and all that comes with that. So, you know, not specific to MindMed or 𝗎𝘀𝗧, but certainly a catalyst for the transition over to MindMed. And many of our 𝗪𝗪 took a huge leap in this regard, was the amount of capital that was available. Drug development is an incredibly expensive proposition. Regardless of how well characterized or how well known the compounds are, you don't get any free passes. And so it's essential that you have access to funding and have funding in place. And so when looking at the opportunities out in the area and organizations that I was connected with, MindMed and the 𝗪𝗪ces and 𝗪𝗪s of the world who already had that bolus of funding in place to really accelerate development programs, really a key personally, and I think for organizationally, and Field Trip's had a lot of success recently in that regard as well. So I think as we've seen more capital come into the space and kind of leadership packs emerging, you see a lot of funding available, and that's going to be really critical. So without that opportunity to raise capital quickly, effectively, you know, and have it there to deploy, it's really a difficult road forward.
Ronan, you have a bit of a different business model than the rest of us here on the panel. And, you know, for you, what countries do you see expanding to, and what sort of molecules or compounds or psychedelics do you plan on working with?
It really depends on which division of our business we're talking about. From field trip health centers that are rolling out the clinical infrastructure, we're going to be molecule agnostic. And so we're in North America, primarily working with ketamine-assisted therapy. We also have a location in the Netherlands working with psilocybin truffles, which is something you have a lot of familiarity with. As we continue to expand, you know, certainly we'll work with psilocybin. You know, we're eager to see MAPS succeed. We're eager to see Compass Pathways succeed in their clinical trials, because our clinical division will benefit from that. We'll be able to deliver greater care. We'll be able to enhance the research, again, because we're talking about contextual medicine. Not every party within the psychedelics community is focused on this, but I think most groups recognize that setting in the therapy that supports a psychedelic experience is pretty significant to the clinical outcomes, but there's not a lot of understanding exactly what that means. We know set and setting is important, but what about set and setting? Is the lighting? Is the music? Is it the therapy? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it different forms? We don't really know, right? So that's the great opportunity with our clinical infrastructure. Globally, geographically, we're focused on North America. Certainly, the FDA has indicated a great receptiveness to working with the drug development on a state-by-state basis. We see things happening every day. Oregon passed Measure 109. We see California with, I forget exactly what the acronym is for the bill for decriminalization. I just got an outreach from people within the California government that want to speak to us about a ballot initiative that's moving forward. Colorado, Florida, Maine, in Canada, we have high confidence that we'll see regulatory change around access to psychedelics, at least for end-of-life distress, potentially before the end of this year. So it's happening everywhere, at least where we're focused right now. And certainly there's conversations in Australia happening in earnest. I have outreach from people in Asia focused on advancing this work. So I do genuinely believe this is a global trend, not because of, I think, the narrative and excitement around psychedelics from a social cultural perspective, but also because of the science. As Lars pointed out, there's a massive global mental health epidemic. And this isn't just, a health consideration. This isn't just compassionate. Like when you look at the economic costs of depression and anxiety globally, it's in the trillions of dollars from lost productivity. So we all, I think, every person on the planet has an interest in seeing psychedelics in whatever form, whether through a political kind of pathway or regulatory pathway, come to market, because there's a lot of needs in society that are being unmet and that I think can be filled quite substantially by psychedelics being provided.
You talk about costs, Ronan, and setting. What is the cost of a ketamine clinic or even your psilocybin therapy within the Netherlands? Because that's part of access for those. If we're being compassionate here and want help, just trying to understand the cost, I think, is a big part of it.
Yeah, costs are a huge consideration. I mean, we have regular dialogue with MAPS thinking about how to navigate the cost structures. But if you think about it, if you look at the MAPS protocol, for example, and I'm not as familiar with the Compass protocol, but with MAPS, for example, the trials they're moving forward with contemplate something like 84 hours of therapist time as part of 3 MDMA-assisted therapy sessions. You don't have to be a genius to figure out that when you have 84 hours of a professional's time involved in 3 sessions, it's going to be expensive. And so insurance coverage is a significant consideration that we're all trying to navigate and understand. And it's an open book right now, but it is going to be an important part of the dialogue. For our treatments right now, using ketamine-assisted therapy, they range from about $750 to $1,000 per session, which includes the ketamine dosing as well as the therapy supporting it, which isn't quite as robust as 84 hours like MAPS, but it is still quite substantive, and we're seeing incredible results. And even at that rate, it excludes probably 90% of the population from being able to access that, because ketamine is being used off-label. So there's not a whole lot of insurance coverage available. So that's one of the really significant and tricky things to consider, which is how do we make this accessible to a large number of people? Because just the labor hours involved in it make it challenging to make it available on a cost-effective basis without robust insurance.
Yeah, I mean, statistics aren't promising, right, for access to Medicare. 2 billion people don't have access to medical systems, essential medicines, basically shutting them off from the benefits of advances in these modern medicines. 30 million people in the United States alone don't even have medical insurance. That's about 10%. 1 in 4 Americans skip medications because they can't afford the costs. Lars, and again, I'm just asking questions, not trying to be challenging or controversial or anything, just really curious. I believe that Compass is sort of talked about in a way, this is strong language, so forgive me if it comes across as strong, but sort of controlling the supply chain. On your website, you talk about that everyone has a mental health story, be it their own or a friend or a loved one, etc. Is Compass sort of open to the idea that, hey, listen, you know what, maybe legalizing access here outside of the medical system might be a benefit, just to be able to provide that access, as opposed to these issues and these numbers that I just spoke about, that 1 in 4 people in this world don't currently have access to medications that have been around forever.
Yeah, that is such an important issue you're addressing there, Todd, because I think we're talking about a very U.S. Specific issue, right? I'm sitting in Europe. Healthcare is a right here. If we deliver the data and we show that psilocybin therapy actually works in treatment-resistant depression and other indications in mental health, and that it's better than other treatments, it will be reimbursed. And it doesn't matter how much money you make. If you're unemployed, if you're employed, you will have access to this therapy. Now, that is very different in the United States. Unfortunately, you pulled out the numbers, and I don't think that for patients the answer is simply legalizing it, because as Ronan said, you will have the therapy container. You will want to do it with a skilled therapist, especially if you have been traumatized and have suffered from a mental health condition for prolonged periods of time. And so you're going to have to deal out of pocket with a significant cost burden. Now, outside of that, I think we're very supportive of decriminalization as an organization. We truly believe no one should go to jail for personal drug use. I don't think that this should be particularly about psychedelics, because when you look at the incarceration rates due to drug use, you are hard-pressed to find people that go to jail for psychedelic use. Those are mostly minorities going to jail for minor drug offenses in the United States. And so that's a real issue that needs addressing. I think in a grown-up society, that's my personal view, everybody should be able to decide what they do with their consciousness on a personal level. But that is not something that we as an organization get involved in any shape or form.
Isn't it a little bit hypocritical, though, Lars, for you to say that you once had a transformational experience using psychedelics? You've obviously found a way to have access for it and to it. I'm not quite sure how. And that maybe others, responsible adults, and don't get me wrong, I believe that education, responsible use, information is of utmost importance here, but not necessarily, guided therapy, not necessarily people who have to be there with you. As responsible adults, we should be able to make choices ourselves. At least I believe that, and it appears as if you did. Is there any hypocrisy in that statement from you?
I hope not. So just to clarify what I said is, I think in order to make medical claims, right, if we want to say, look, we treat someone who has a severe depressive episode or treatment-resistant depression or suicidal, now we have a system that regulates that. In the United States, that's the FDA. And so in order to make health claims, you got to run the studies, you got to present the data. On recreational use, that's why I said, look, as an organization, we can absolutely get behind decriminalization. I personally believe that people should be able to choose whatever they want to do with their lives. And so indeed, I benefited outside of the system from 𝗪𝗪𝗏. So my personal opinion is that the Western world needs a drug reform. The war on drug has failed. I think Michael Pollan has a very educated, good opinion on how that might shake out. I recommend everybody read his new book. I think that's a very good position that he has.
And sorry, Lars, just to stay with you, what are your thoughts on Measure 109 in Oregon? Because, currently the way it's being written, it's not actually from a prescriptive model. It's from more of a screening and educational model for access for all adults. It doesn't just have to be end of care, compassionate grounds, severe trauma. They're sort of saying, hey, we can do this and provide access, hopefully. Is that something that you disagree with?
No, I don't disagree with Oregon. I think it shows the need, right? I was really surprised when I saw the vote come in and how strongly the Oregon population supported that vote. And it just shows that the need is tremendous. Again, I would say that we want to develop a system where people can access these therapies at scale through reimbursement. I have a hard time seeing how the Oregon model will scale to a level where United Health will get behind it, or an Optum to fund that therapy approach. And again, I think it's really important to make sure that if we want to make health claims, we need to know for whom does psilocybin therapy work, and for that we have a system. Yeah.
Appreciate it, Rob. How does technology play into that understanding of how these treatments aren't working, and in terms of trying to make these medical claims? Can technology make the difference? And I'll add a second part to that question. We talked about access to Medicare and access to medications for a lot of the people who don't have it in this world. And Lars, I would add that it's not just a United States problem. I'd say it's a massive third world problem. And can technology with the use of cell phones help expedite that, at least in terms of knowledge and education?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think certainly what we are seeking to do with technology is to facilitate the patient engagement, patient access to treatments, and ultimately making sure that it is scalable. Because I think one something that I'll say that is probably different than what you're going to hear from others is that as a drug developer and as a drug manufacturing organization, our goal is to get drugs on the market, and then physicians have a lot of discretion about how they use those drugs. So we really move away from trying to be overly prescriptive about the psychotherapy or setting kind of elements. That is not to say that I support, or we as an organization support, legalization or just going out in the broader world. And we think technology can be used in some capacities to facilitate the scalability and the monitoring of patients, both during sessions and outside of sessions. I think a lot of groups are working on similar kind of concepts, but really we want to lean in that direction, try to utilize tools and give physicians and practitioners tools that allow them to adopt not only psychedelics, but other therapies at larger scale with less human hours per unit of patient outcome. That ultimately we think that's how we're going to achieve larger scale rollout, not constraining delivery by hours and hours of psychotherapy. I think the number quoted for the MAP psychotherapy, that's just frankly never going to get reimbursed in the United States. I don't see a path how there's ever a framework. And if we are banking on that happening, we will be grossly unsuccessful. It would be really a tragedy in the long run. So we have to think creatively about how to work within the current system. And the current system can leverage, there's a number of tools available to us. Drugs are one of those. We're effectively tool makers. We provide tools to physicians that they can go out and use them. And to the extent we can do that in a way that the tools are leverageable by physicians and by healthcare practitioners that may not be physicians, that may be lower degree psychotherapists, for instance. That's how we look to utilize technology and how we approach commercialization and deployment of psychedelics more generally.
Clearly, no one can make the medical claims yet, Rob, but we do know there's a mental health crisis going on right now. You talk about a larger rollout. How do you envision that rollout looking globally, and how sort of do you see it looking out on a time frame issue? Like if the mental health crisis is now, and we're confident that the work that everyone's putting into this can help it, can we expedite this? Is there any chances of that, working with governments and regulatory bodies to get it done sooner rather than later?
I mean, I think that there is an urgent need, that is clear. And I think I would caveat what you said and say that we're very optimistic that these therapies have the potential to work. You know that they work and that they're safe when you get an FDA approval. And that is the whole development, or an EMA approval, or any regulatory competent authority approving your drug. The whole drug development process is set up to establish definitively the safety and effectiveness of drugs based on the conditions of use described in the label and REMS and whatever else is appended to that. So how we see it rolling out broadly, I think it is going to take time, and it should take time. It should be done responsibly. It should be done through well-established pathways with rigorous science. And if ultimately the opportunity comes to fruition, which we certainly are all personally and organizationally invested in seeing happen, then it will be geographically sequential, likely. You see a lot of first approvals in the US and Europe, and then the rest of the world can open up. And there will have to also be, I just say, given the name of this talk, there will have to be a concerted international effort, because there's still controlled substance restrictions that are more global than simply state or country restrictions. So thinking long term about international transportation of controlled substances and the challenges that presents both commercially and in development. If the broader world wants this to be successful, legislatively tearing down red tape or barriers to actually conducting the rigorous science should be our motivation. And I would say, just last comment is, I would say that is where our effort would be most effective and is best spent, is not legalization, but facilitation of more effective and more efficient research. That's what all of us, I think, are after, really, is being able to get drugs through the process as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and respectfully, I completely disagree with that statement. But obviously, for my self-interest, my business, it's very different. But also, I think that I support the science. I believe, Rob, that my 78-year-old father would probably much more prefer a standardized synthetic form of psilocybin if he thought it could help him in some way, if that was being proven. I don't think that all 20, 30, 40-year-olds would definitely think that way. We're seeing it even with COVID-19, right? Look how many people are against the vaccines of COVID-19. So, we're showing that there is distrust in big pharma. and that people want more natural occurring ways to take care of their bodies. My body, my choice. That's what a lot of people are thinking and saying. And I think that with the crisis happening right now, why isn't there kind of a mix between both? And I think, Ronan, you really do have this mix between both. Let's be honest. Everything you're doing at Field Trip is a little bit of the mix between both, of the science, of the regulations, but also of the access. Ketamine kind of got through when maybe others didn't in the 70s. I think it was around the 70s. It's not my, studied drug here. And you work now with Magic Truffles in the Netherlands. And what I want to relate it to you, Ronan, is sort of the way we look at alcohol, for example. Alcohol, I'm going to pull up some stats here. 3 million people, they say, WHO says, have complications due to alcohol every year. 95,000 in the U.S. die because of alcohol. There's 480,000 deaths in the United States that actually from smoking, and 41,000 of those are from secondhand smokers. So when you think of alcohol and you think of cigarette smoke, do governments really, should they be able to restrict then these substances if they're restricting other substances?
That's a deeply political and philosophical question. And, personally, my viewpoint is that, no, I think absolutely psychedelics should be legalized. I think there's this unenlightened tendency to think that the mental health crisis is a medical problem. I don't think it's a medical problem. I would argue it's much more of a spiritual, emotional, philosophical problem, where a lot of it, not entirely, I think the science has a lot to play with it, or a lot to do with it, because we know, our lifestyles and how we live and what we eat has a significant impact on our mental health as well. So it's not entirely isolated, but whether government should have a role in this, my answer is I'm a big believer that thoughtful, articulate regulation makes a lot of sense, that there's a lot of ways where, and it sounds very libertarian, even though I tend to lean on a very left end of the political spectrum, which is to say that regulation makes sense, particularly where there's externalities associated with it, where the risk to people outside of yourself is greater than the cost benefit to yourself. The problem I have with most regulation is that it creates a whole lot of unintended consequences, and it leads to bad decisions, and it gets used to implement political controls. Certainly, psychedelics are a prime example of where regulations were not based on science or evidence. They were based on a political mandate to try and disenfranchise certain minorities who represented a risk to the majority. I don't think there's a whole lot, and I'm not a conspiracy theory on that. I think that's pretty well documented on this. So on alcohol and smoking, I do think that thoughtful education and restrictions may make sense, but it's a big question. But overall, as it pertains to psychedelics and the relative risk benefit analysis, risk of addiction, risk of overdose, I think it certainly supports legalization. And I think, but the thing is, I think they can operate in parallel. I think Measure 109 is wonderful, and I think the work Compass Pathways is doing is wonderful, and they can both coexist. And they're both, as you mentioned, going to serve different audiences. And the more reach, the more impact we can have, the better. And so we should be pursuing all avenues to enable people to have access to, whether it's treating mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, whatever the case may be, or people who just want to deal with their trauma, or people who just want to have a deeper connection to spirit or God or whatever you want to call it. Wonderful. All of these things are thoughtful and should be supported. And I think the job is to educate and put some constraints on it to minimize the downside risk. And there is downside risk, associated with any drugs. But I think vis-a-vis psychedelics, the relative risks are pretty low.
Yeah, I read a stat recently that it said you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to die from some sort of overdose using psilocybin. So, I don't know if that's necessarily, if it's conjecture, but it was out there. Ronan, what about simply having fun? What about those who just recreationally want to use some of these drugs to have fun? Is that irresponsible to think that way?
I don't think it's irresponsible to think that way, and I don't have a perfect answer, but in those circumstances, that's where the increased risk happens, right? Where people make bad decisions or do something stupid. It's no different than drunk driving, right? We don't permit that, but certainly I wouldn't want anyone on psilocybin driving either, right? These are rational limitations. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't know exactly how you set that up to minimize risk and maximize benefit, though. That's something I think we just got to, continue iterating on. I think it was the Finnish government recently has adopted design principles to creating regulations, and it's smart. They're constantly iterating to try and find that right balance, and I think that's what we're all striving for.
Lars, upwards around 40% of pharmaceutical drugs in the Western world are derived from plants that have been used by indigenous peoples for centuries. Everywhere but the Arctic, essentially, is psychedelic substances, and underground Western therapists have been using psychedelic therapy, as you know, to help people since the 70s. Do you think that psychedelic companies such as yours can be a bit different than the pharmaceutical companies and give these cultures the credit that they deserve?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the question is, where do you begin, right? I think we can talk about the Mazatec or other native tribes in Mexico. We can talk about mushroom use in North America, South America, Brazil, Celtic mushroom use, Bavarian mushroom use, Ukrainian mushroom use, and they all had their different containers, the way to go about it. So it's very difficult to say, where to start, where to end. So I think that's why 𝗪𝗪 doesn't fall under the Nagoya protocol in terms of kind of genetic inheritance, because there's no place to pinpoint where 𝗪𝗪 therapy or spiritual use originally came from. That's not to say that we can't have a different approach than standard pharma to developing this. And I know it begins with us developing not simply a small molecule intervention amongst the four of us here, right? I think it's a whole therapy. There's the container that's being developed, which makes it very difficult probably for pharma to wrap their heads around how to develop that and how to commercialize it and bring it eventually to commercial success and help patients at scale. Now, there's the other question of, how do you price such a treatment, right? And how do you make sure this is accessible? And in pharma, you basically have two models. You can either say, look, you focus on a niche, you come in with the most the highest price you can possibly get in terms of reimbursement for niche indication, makes it much easier to scale. Or you look at budget impact and you say, look, we focus on the other side of the equation to optimize access by pricing this treatment so cost competitively that most of the patients that would benefit from it can access that. And that has been very much at the core of what we're doing. Even before we started the company, we were working already with 3 payer institutions in Europe to understand where would they be supportive to reimburse 𝗪𝗪 therapy. We've broadened that out. We worked through the EMA HTA process, bringing all the payers together to answer what does the phase 2, phase 3 need to look like for reimbursement at scale. We have built a similar process ourselves in the United States to get to reimbursement, and that will be always our core. And that's why we're not saying we're a pharmaceutical company or a psychedelic company. But that's why we define ourselves as a mental health care company with the final vision to create a world of mental well-being. And I think with psychedelic therapy, we really have a chance to get there. And I very much agree with what Ronan said. I think this pandemic can't be reduced to a single biological motive. I think there's a bigger issue at play here. And I think psychedelics can be that change agent that allows people to recontextualize their lives, understand their place in the world, and have a very different outlook afterwards.
I mean, hearing you say that, it's I love it because it's empathetic and it's beautiful. It's beautifully said. And for any of those people who are watching right now have used psychedelics in sort of this set and setting and responsible use manners, I think you would see or feel probably the very same statement what you just said, Lars. And I hope as all our companies move forward, we figure out these paths with all the hurdles, what this really conversation is about, as we're setting up shop here to figure out a way to be able to get people access in the most responsible ways. Rob, what I want to ask you, because it is interesting, you did used to work for 𝗪𝗎, and from what I understand, I did a little bit of research into it. I didn't know a ton of it until really, preparing for this interview here. I believe that their mentality was sort of putting their not like patents into an open form, an open domain. That the idea there wasn't kind of having the control that, say, pharma companies or mental health companies, Lars, would. What are your thoughts on that? Like, did you believe in that then, and now maybe it's a little bit different of a focus with MindMed now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can speak to what 𝗪𝗎's overall strategy is. They're a signatory to this open science collaborative. I think MAPS is a part of as well. So that tells you what you need to know about that. You know, I think everyone has a different take on and a different angle, a different perspective on the development of these drugs, these therapies, different views on the commercial terms under which they should be developed. And there's been a sort of public debate about intellectual property. You know, intellectual property is one aspect of controlling a market or trying to exercise exclusivity. It is not the only opportunity to do that. So it's somewhat of a not a distraction, but it narrows the focus on one topic when there's really a broader discussion to be had about the utility of making sure you have well-controlled distribution channels, both from a safety standpoint, quality standpoint. I mean, there's a number of reasons why having well-controlled and defined distribution and manufacturing channels makes good sense and is protective to patients and physicians. So, I mean, I won't say that philosophically I've had some revolution internally. You know, there's a bit of knowing what needs to be done and needing to be effective in our roles for our organizations and whatever that mission is. We should all be dedicated to that and seeing that through.
And I think that's fair. Listen, different companies, different mission statements, different core strategies, like, of course. And you know, I wish success for all of us, because at the end of the day, I think all of us can help people. We can't make that claim yet. But Rob, I got to tell you, it seems as if you, like, I'm hearing from Ronan about the legalization. I'm hearing Lars from, you know, personal conversations that he's had in the past and understanding why he's sort of gone into this industry and maybe a little bit more lenient in terms of the thoughts of the mentality of the group. And for you, though, it seems like you're really against kind of doing it any other way than say the pharma model. And you know, I ask all of us as we leave here, one of the things in the organizations, I think, which we all follow very closely and probably applaud, is what 𝗪𝘀𝘃 has done for end of care patients and those who are terminally ill. The government of Canada has granted exemption 56 1-year licenses for those to do either heroic dose or a couple of dosages within hopefully some sort of guided therapy sessions. While they haven't allowed really to say where they get that access from, they've allowed them to use it. If you know, and this is a personal question, and listen, sorry, I'm from the media background, so I always got personal with any guests I spoke of, and it's not loaded, Ronan, but if you knew someone right now very close to you who very sadly got diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer or something, and knowing that the work you want to do, you wish you could help them right now, but you can't because you're just not there yet as companies, and you had access to a natural occurring product, and they had read and said, hey, listen, I saw what happened with X individual, and they really felt it helped them to come to terms with their anxiety as a end of care and dealing with their family and sort of overcoming some tragedy as they sadly, very sadly, leave life. Would you tell that person that you wouldn't want them to exit this way, knowing that your medications aren't available yet?
That to me, I would tell them to do what they feel is right for them and to consult their healthcare providers about what is right, what the risks are, and what. I'm not a physician. I'm not in a position to instruct people about how to take care of themselves. And listen, I just want to make it clear. I think my personal politics or views, and I absolutely agree with the objective of minimizing incarceration and decriminalization. Sending folks to jail for having psychedelics would be horrible. It also doesn't happen, as has been already said. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's a valid question. I think, again, personal views are one thing. What we need to do to get these therapies, these drugs across the finish line. I mean, you can look at a playbook for, yeah, we could do this. Just use the U.S. as an example. Use it state by state and say, oh, I should start making a bunch of noise here in my home state and try to convince the legislative bodies to overturn regulation. That's a path. That takes a very long time and a lot of disjointed efforts to ultimately get there. You look at MAPS, MAPS has been doing it for a long time. You look at Compass. I think for others of us, MindMed, Field Trip, hopefully, like there's a direct path. One of the great things about drug development is that it's so well defined and it's expensive, but it's a direct path. I mean, you know exactly what you have to do to get a drug across the finish line, and we can do it much faster than you're going to convince 50 states or, God forbid, the US Congress to overturn a Controlled Substance Act. I just don't have a whole lot of confidence that that's the way to get those individuals who we care about access to these therapies as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, and very sadly, though, we see 6% of those age 12 or older misuse prescriptions at least once in the past year. So I mean, that's why I'm just trying to open, the mindset of everyone with these hurdles as we go into it. What is the optionality here? And Ronan, you must see great optionality in your business and great results in terms of maybe an example of a ketamine experience that a patient, I don't know, obviously, if you confidentiality, what you can disclose or not, but, back to that question I asked about end of care. And if you knew someone, would you recommend a ketamine clinic, or would you recommend one of your truffle therapy sessions?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Rob's kind of comment, which is they need to do what's right for them, but certainly I'd advocate for it. Certainly, I think people should seek out what they need, and if that means going underground, then wonderful. I mean, it's I'm a big believer that people need to do what's right, especially when the externalities are virtually zero, right? If someone chooses to do a psilocybin-assisted therapy session, the consequences and the benefits are on them, and I think that's a perfectly valid choice for people to make.
Great. And Lars, just to wrap it up with you, and listen, 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is the leader, right? And congrats on being the leader. And I think no one is trying to cast stones. We're super pleased that everyone is working as hard and how relevant this sector has become over the last couple of years. It's really quite remarkable, actually, if you think of the hundreds of years before it. What are your thoughts on sort of providing access if someone might want it now?
Yeah, no, well, I second what Ronan said. I think we're not physicians, right? I think people need to make their own choices. There are ways to access this treatment modality in a legally safe container at the moment at a fairly high cost. What I would always say, look out for some of the studies that are ongoing. So, for example, we're involved in a cancer patient study at the moment in Maryland. That is still enrolling, and so I would point people to that study and see if they qualify, where they can do it with some of the most skilled therapists in the world, and hope they would get into such a study.
Lars, thank you very much. I think we now are moving on to our breakout session. We're going to another room. But in the intern, I want to thank every single person for watching this. Very informative, very educational, hopefully fun. I really appreciate Rob from MindMed joining us, Ronan from Field Trip joining us, and of course, Lars from 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Thank you so much for being with us. And we're going to join in. We're going to take some questions. If you're the premium access, I guess this is where they get you for a little extra money or something at these PsyTech things. But come and join us. Of course, I'm Todd Shapiro from Red Light Holland, and we look forward to more of these talks as we continually evolve and continually provide access one form or another, or hopefully all forms. Thank you again. We really do appreciate all of you joining us, and thanks to PsyTech Global.
Thank you, Todd.